This week, Russia and Belarus began the largest joint nuclear exercises in modern history. 65,000 soldiers, 200 missile launchers, 13 submarines. And at the center of all this is Belarus, a country that was neutral until recently and is now aiming warheads at Europe. But what the news isn't explaining is what's behind all of this, because this story didn't start now. It started with a choice that Lukashenko made years ago and that he can no longer undo. To understand what's happening today, we need to go back to August of 2020. Belarus was on fire, not literally, but almost. After a presidential election that the whole world considered a fraud, the people took to the streets. There were weeks of protest. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets all over the country. It was the biggest popular movement the country had seen in decades. Factory workers went on strike, public employees marched, and women formed human chains on the avenues. Lukashenko seemed finished. The world was expecting his downfall. But then came the phone call. Putin called and made an offer the dictator couldn't refuse. Political support, billions in financial aid, and, if necessary, military backing. In exchange, Belarus would become increasingly dependent on Russia. Lukashenko agreed. The protests were violently crushed. Thousands of people were arrested. He survived. But at that moment, without signing any papers, without any official statement, he gave up something he would never be able to recover: the sovereignty of his own country. The people who took to the streets to overthrow Lukashenko didn't know that, by failing, they were paving the way for something much worse. Not just the dictator in power, but a dictator who now owed everything to Putin and would pay that debt with the entire country. And do you know what Putin does when someone owes him a favor that big? He collects slowly in installments. The first installment was paid in February of 2022. When Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he needed a route through the north. Belarus had that border. And Lukashenko opened the doors. Not because he wanted to, but because he owed him. Russian troops crossed Belarusian territory and tried to take the city of Kyiv in a matter of days. The attempt failed. The Ukrainian army pushed them back. But the message was recorded in history. Belarus was no longer a neutral country. It was a launch pad. But that debt didn't end there. Over the following years, the Russian presence in the country grew silently, almost invisibly. Russian antennas and equipment began to appear on the rooftops of ordinary residential buildings in Belarusian cities. They weren't telephone equipment, they were systems that helped guide Shahed drones, Russian weaponry used to attack Ukrainian cities, to their targets in the west of the country. The ordinary people of Belarus were turned into a shield without even knowing it. And then came the heaviest part of all. In December 2025, Russia installed the Oreshnik missile system on Belarusian soil. The Oreshnik is a hypersonic missile with nuclear capability. It flies at more than 10 times the speed of sound. It's so fast that there is no defense system in the world capable of intercepting it. It can reach targets up to 5,000 kilometers away. Just to give you an idea, if launched from Belarus, it would reach Berlin in less than 10 minutes. That puts almost all of Europe within the firing range of this weapon. Launched from the territory of a country that, just a few years ago, told the world it didn't want war with anyone. It was exactly with this system that this week's exercises were conducted. 65,000 troops, 200 missile launchers, 140 aircraft, 13 submarines. The largest joint nuclear operation in history between the two countries, presented to the world as a simple routine training. But none of this is routine. And here's the detail that's going unnoticed amid all this noise. Because while the world is watching the nuclear exercises, Lukashenko is making a separate move, in parallel. which could be even more revealing about what's coming next. On May 12th, during a meeting with his Minister of Defense, he declared that Belarus will mobilize its military units to prepare them for combat operations. More than 6,000 reservists have already been inspected. Lukashenko presented a plan to modernize his weaponry over the next 5 years. Roads are being built along the border with Ukraine. Artillery positions are being set up along that same border. And Lukashenko said it clearly: "We are all preparing for war. God willing, it can be avoided." When a dictator announces that he is preparing for war and in the same sentence prays it won't happen, you already understand the size of the problem. Because this is not a leader planning an attack of his own will. It's a man who feels he has no choice. And the question that remains is, who is on the other side of that choice? Ukraine already has the answer. Zelensky publicly warned that Russia seems to be trying to drag Belarus into the war. And there are 3 concrete ways this could happen, each with different consequences for the conflict. The first scenario is the most likely in the short term. Belarus mobilizes its forces and positions them along the border with Ukraine without crossing it. Imagine columns of military vehicles, tanks, and troop transports stationed just a few kilometers from Ukrainian territory day after day. At first glance, it seems less serious than an invasion. But it's not. Ukraine can't simply ignore an army positioned so close. It would be forced to move soldiers from the eastern border to cover the northern border. And it's exactly on the eastern border in Donetsk that Russia is applying maximum pressure at this moment. Weakening that line to cover another point is exactly what Putin wants, without having to fire a single shot from Belarus. If the first scenario is worrying, the second is even more straightforward. Advance towards Kyiv. Imagine a column of troops coming down from the north along open roads heading toward the Ukrainian capital, which is less than 170 kilometers from the Belarusian border. In 2022, Russia tried this same route and was driven out. But the situation today is different. Ukraine has been at war for more than 4 years. Its resources are limited, and a column coming from the north would open a route separate from the heaviest fighting in the east. Ukraine is getting ready. 14,000 soldiers are positioned on the northern border, and more than 1,000 kilometers of fortifications have been built along that line. Even so, any advance in that direction would force Ukraine to pull soldiers from other places where they are badly needed. And there is a second consequence that few are taking into account. If Belarus crosses the border, Poland and Lithuania, members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will have a neighbor actively at war on their border. That changes the calculation for the entire alliance. And if the first 2 scenarios look like a conventional war, the third one is different. It's quieter, more patient, and perhaps the most effective of all. Instead of a mass advance, small Belarusian units would be secretly sent to western Ukraine. Small groups without uniforms, not in combat formation. Each one with a specific target. A bridge, a rail line, a fuel depot. The goal wouldn't be to conquer territory, it would be to paralyze. To cut off the routes through which weapons and supplies arrive from Western Europe. If those corridors are destroyed, the impact spreads across the entire front line. Without ammunition, without spare parts, without fuel. Even the most well-trained soldier can no longer fight. Many analysts think it's a bluff, that Lukashenko barks but doesn't bite. And the greater likelihood is that they're right, for now. But there's something that this reasoning leaves out. This cycle is self-reinforcing. The more Ukraine diverts troops to the north, the more Russia advances in the east. The more Russia advances, the more Putin pressures Lukashenko to do the same. It's a spiral designed in Russia and executed by Belarus. In any of these three scenarios, the real goal was never a Belarusian victory. It's a Russian victory. Lukashenko would be used as a tool of distraction, attrition, and pressure at multiple points at the same time. His soldiers, mostly without real motivation to fight in a war that the Belarusian people never wanted, would die so that Putin could advance elsewhere. And the president of Belarus knows that. He just doesn't have the power to say no anymore. But there's a layer to this story that goes beyond any military scenario. And that's the one the news rarely covers. Think carefully about what's happening here. A man who ruled with an iron fist for over 30 years, who survived protests, sanctions, and pressure from the entire world. This man is praying to God that the war doesn't happen, because he knows he doesn't control anything anymore. Lukashenko hasn't gone crazy. He is a man who has lost control of his own country and still hasn't admitted it to the world. In 2020, he chose to survive politically. But the price of that survival was paid with the sovereignty of Belarus. And that price is now being exacted now in ever larger installments. Oreshnik, located on Belarusian territory, is not under Lukashenko's control. The drones that cross Belarusian airspace are not controlled by Belarus. They are controlled by Russia. The most important decisions about the future of the country are not made there. They are made in Moscow, in Russia. The truth is that Belarus has become a Russian military base with its own flag. And Lukashenko now carries out Putin's orders. The question is no longer whether he will enter the war. The real question is this. When Putin decides the time has come, will Lukashenko be able to say no? The history of the last 5 years suggests that the answer is no. And, as Europe watches this week's nuclear exercises with growing concern, it's worth remembering one thing. This is not the beginning of a crisis. It is the result of a choice made in 2020 being paid for now, in real time, installment by installment. The installment that Lukashenko is paying today is called sovereignty. And it was spent a long time ago. And what do you think? Do you believe that Belarus will actually enter the war in Ukraine? Or does Lukashenko still have some room to resist Putin's pressure? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this content made you see the conflict from a different angle, share it with someone who needs to understand this game. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. We're back every week with analyses that go beyond the news. See you in the next video.